Jersey Universalist Church was once a thriving religious community, recounts historian, professor, and Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend Dr. Susan Ritchie. As with many of our Universalist congregations across the more rural parts of the Midwest, it flourished with the message of universal salvation in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Become the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists in 1961, Jersey Universalist opted not to be contaminated by the Unitarian heresy, as Ritchie says, and they continued on into the 1990s and later as Universalists, being served faithfully by their Universalist minister until he died. Because the overwhelming majority of Unitarian and Universalist congregations did elect to be part of the Unitarian Universalist Association, there were no longer purely Universalist ministers to choose their next minister from following his death. And so the Jersey Universalist Church returned to an old Universalist custom and ordained lay leaders from the congregation to serve as their ministers. A quick refresher on Universalism. Like Unitarianism in some ways, Universalism has also been considered a heresy of Christianity and is distinctly U.S. American. Hosea Ballou, considered by many to be our first Universalist theologian, wrote in his A Treatise on Atonement that a truly loving God would want humans to be happy, and also that God would not condemn any of humanity to eternal damnation. We are his children after all, and God loves us, no matter how dirtied we might become in our humanly living. So the Jersey Universalist Church was ordaining lay ministers, and this seemed to serve the congregation well for a while, until it didn't. We know this because Reverend Ritchie serves a congregation in the area and would call to check in on them periodically, sharing the good word of our faith with them as they were not in relationship with any other congregation. The congregation continued to be cared for, as was the building they met in. But somehow, over time, around the fourth or fifth lay minister that was ordained, something was lost. And of all the somethings, the message of universalism was lost. Not only was it lost, but somehow the message had been completely flipped. The last lay leader there had begun preaching a doctrine of hell and damnation. The congregation has since closed. Looking back further in our Unitarian Universalist history, it wouldn't be wrong to be surprised that Unitarian Universalists draw the cornerstone of our faith from the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Both wanted reform of the church, but chose to address it differently. The Pilgrims rejected professions of faith like the Nicene Creed, a Trinitarian statement of faith, and the Pilgrims affirmed religious tolerance, refusing to persecute Quakers and maintaining a 40-year peace pact with the Wampanoag peoples. Both the Pilgrims and the Puritans rejected hierarchical church authority, believing in each congregation's right to self-governance by the vote of its members. The Puritans were so insistent that each congregation be governed by its own members that after some years of discussion, they signed the Cambridge Platform in 1648. This is the document that first laid out how our congregations should be constituted and work. Our congregations work within the frame of congregational polity, essentially a fancy term for covenants for congregations. And especially as Unitarianism spread from Massachusetts and then New England, sometimes we are really bad at this. However, for our founders, the autonomy of each congregation did not imply either self-sufficiency or isolation from other congregations. They were to be a community of independent churches, giving and taking counsel and helping each other in other ways. This is where the idea of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Member Congregations came from. So congregations make covenants together, and individual members of congregations make covenants together. That's another part of the heritage of the Cambridge platform, the forming of churches around covenants. Covenants are a promise to work and be together in religious community. They are living texts, not statements of faith, but words that must be lived into and when broken, must be returned to. Joining a church means joining a covenantal community, covenanting with your neighbors, other members, in spiritual growth. Love is the foundation of the work to be done within and among us. We commit to mutual learning and teaching and growing. We commit to supporting and serving our community. At our best, we commit to allowing the margins to hold the center. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, this is very interesting, and you're starting to wonder why I'm telling you this. As the world has become more obviously challenging to some of us in the last 10 or so years, for some especially during this current administration, our call as Unitarian Universalists has in some ways sharpened and been challenged, both from within and without. And who we are matters to how we respond to these challenges. During the 2019 General Assembly, a minister from Washington, who I will decline to refer to as a colleague, self-published a book whose name I decline to share. The book is full of racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, and generally disregard for those who are marginalized. The book was freely handed out from a booth at General Assembly. Given its sensational and toxic histories and theologies, the minister was quickly told how concerning and harmful his work was to many who were present at General Assembly, including those to whom the book had deliberately been given. The minister then declined to engage in conversation with individuals, with representatives of the General Assembly, or any group, including our Ministers Association, that attempted to talk with him, and also declined to agree to be in right relationship with the gathered community. And so he was not allowed to return. Since the book's release, it has continued to do damage, and this has rippled throughout Unitarian Universalism. Those like this minister who do not support our faith's move to addressing a white supremacy culture in the wider world and now within our own faith feel more justified and emboldened by the publishing of this work and the backlash it has largely gotten from Unitarian Universalists. A well-known writer and chaplain, a minister I also decline to refer to as a colleague, whose work helped me recognize my call to ministry, has supported the minister who wrote the General Assembly book, and Stoking the Fire challenged Unitarian Universalists to answer the question, am I still a Unitarian Universalist minister? While this may not seem important in general to our laity, I believe it is, because this is a question of who we are and how your ministers agree to be in relationship is reflective of our shared values and ethics, as well as our history and our visions for the future, and the way we dream for our congregations to be in relationship with each other and for our congregants to be in relationship with each other. And I can only answer her question, given the information that I shared with you earlier, that our faith has been defined by covenant. And in not keeping it, the short answer to her question is no. Ministry is many things, but easy is not one of them. There are reasons why some ministers do some things and others don't. Some ministers choose not to go into fellowship with the Unitarian Universalist Association. Some of those are community ministers who don't believe they will benefit from the great work and or may not have the money required to go through the process. I understand. Whether a minister has gone through fellowshipping, there are 2 collegial organizations that ministers can join that are specifically for ministers. This allows ministers to be recognized as colleagues and to be in covenant with each other. The covenant of our relationships is laid out in guidelines, and all members of either of these organizations are bound by their respective covenants. Breaking of covenant has consequences which are determined by a designated body when brought before them. Ordination by a Unitarian Universalist congregation does make a person a minister, but it does not make them a Unitarian Universalist minister. This goes for professional or lay ministers, a fact demonstrated fairly clearly by the Jersey Universalist Church I mentioned at the beginning of this service. What does matter is the relationships, and specifically the covenants we keep. This is so important to our Ministers Association that as a community minister, I am obligated to maintain good standing and fellowship, to be affiliated with a congregation. I'd want to do it anyway because I love our congregations, but it is a requirement for me to be in right relationship with my colleagues and to be accountable not only to my colleagues, but to our shared faith. When I meet new colleagues, and it's like 2 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, I want to know whose they are. I want to know what congregation they serve or are affiliated with, and sometimes too where they have been. I want to know if they are a member of our Ministers Association and what chapter they belong to. If they don't belong to the Ministers Association, maybe they belong to the Association for Community Ministers, and I want to know about that. I want to know if they attend meetings for their chapter, and if not, how are they in relationship with Unitarian Universalism? It may be through Church of the Larger Fellowship, our online congregation. It may be participating in one of our statewide or other organizations. I expect that they attend church. And if they don't, And if their relationships with our faith are limited or basically do not exist, I question whether they are my colleague. A hallmark of being a member of a religious community is practicing the faith with others. Religion cannot happen alone. Spirituality can, of course, but not religion, and certainly not ours. For ministers who live and work outside our covenants, outside our congregations, away from our people, I also question their identity as Unitarian Universalists and colleagues because they are not bound by the same standards I am. I'm not saying that they're necessarily bad ministers, but I do question fundamentally whether they are ours. As a people who have rejected creeds or other statements of faith for at least a few generations, there is nothing that binds us as Unitarian Universalists other than our covenants. Covenants are uniquely practiced by Unitarian Universalists, and this is how we know both who we are and who we want to be. Those who do not covenant with us simply are not Unitarian Universalists. The book that was published and handed out this last summer at General Assembly was deeply damaging to many. It was damaging to many of the members of that minister's congregation who had not been aware of their minister's views on the topics addressed in that book and who were themselves offended. It was damaging to the people the book was given to at General Assembly. It was damaging to my friends and colleagues who are trans and non-binary, anti-racist, women, disabled, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And beyond the damage created by this book, which is very much still continuing now, further damage was done when people expressed their hurt and the author declined or refused to engage in conversation with any of them about the damage done. He refused and refuses to be held accountable or to return to covenant. This happened at General Assembly, happened in his congregation, happened among colleagues in the local ministers chapter, and with colleagues in the leadership of our Ministers Association. The book makes arguments in the name of logic and reason. We white liberals value our intelligence and believe in the value of logic and reason. And I have learned this to be an expression of white supremacy culture. The book was written as a reaction to the work that Unitarian Universalists have been engaging in the last few years to address the white supremacy culture within ourselves and our institutions. The book is just the kind of thing many of us are working to grow away from. This book was a blatant refusal to engage in this anti-white supremacy work, followed by a blatant refusal to engage in any way in the practice that is the core of our faith. Unitarian Universalism cannot work when individuals refuse to be in relationship where the individuals, or congregations for that matter, refuse to communicate with each other, to be accountable, to be held in covenant. Why all this matters is because, in Leslie Takahashi's words, the margins hold the center. When we cannot be accountable to each other, even to those in the very center of power, how can we possibly be accountable to those who are at the margins of power? If we cannot be accountable to the margins, the center cannot hold. Like a tarp being thrown up in the air without hands to hold the outside, the whole thing gets loose and collapses. Working at the margins shows us where we need to grow to get closer to who we want to be, shows us the work to be done, shows us the way forward, and shows us where we are failing. The margins are where our faith has the most promise to bring us closer to the beloved kingdom we seek. And it is at the margins that we recognize where the bounds of Unitarian Universalism are, and how we know the work that we yet need to do to become the people we want to be. We are a people that moves ever forward to answer the call of justice here on earth, the only place we can be sure justice can happen. Calling on our Unitarian forebears who believed earnestly in the promise of the human potential for good, in the depth of that promise, in the being of that promise, and on our Universalist forebears who believed as earnestly in the promise of human equity, in the breadth of that promise, the doing of that promise. We are called ever forward by their visions for our faith, even as we live into them differently than they might have. This is our legacy and our covenant with the past, the present, and the future. We cannot live into this covenant when we leave those who have been marginalized behind in favor of those who refuse to be accountable, who refuse to be in right relationship, who refuse to live into the dreams promised to us that justice shall one day roll down and we will be a part of it, so long as we do the work together. Indeed, this is the only way it can be done.